In the volatile world of the young and the restless, not every betrayal begins with intention, some are born from silence. From the slow erosion of trust that no one notices until it's too late. What appears, on the surface, to be just another strained marriage is quietly spiraling into something far more dangerous. Where love is no longer the anchor but the very thing pulling everything under. Abby Winters and Devon Winters are no longer fighting for each other, they are fighting against versions of themselves they no longer recognize. And in the shadows of that unraveling, Daniel Romolotti Jr. emerges not as a savior, but as a catalyst, someone whose presence threatens to ignite emotions that should have remained buried. Lines begin to blur, loyalties begin to fracture, and what starts as emotional refuge may soon become something far more destructive. Because in a story where every choice carries a cost, the real question isn't who will fall, it's who will be left standing when the truth finally comes crashing down. The fracture in Abby and Devon's marriage did not happen all at once, it spread quietly, like a crack beneath polished glass. Invisible until the pressure became too great to contain. What once felt like stability had turned into something brittle, something sharp enough to wound with the slightest touch. Every disagreement layered itself atop the last, building a silent architecture of resentment that neither of them fully acknowledged. Yet both could feel pressing down on them. At the center of it all was a moral divide neither could reconcile. Devon's rigid stance on what he believed was justice had hardened into something unyielding, leaving no room for empathy or compromise. To him, the world was suddenly simple: right and wrong, consequences and accountability. But to Abby, that simplicity felt cruel, stripped of humanity. She saw nuance where he saw defiance, compassion where he saw weakness. And the more he dug into his convictions, the more she felt erased, as though her voice carried no weight in the life they were supposed to share. That realization did something irreversible inside her. It wasn't just anger, it was displacement. She began to feel like a stranger in her own home, moving through familiar spaces that no longer belonged to her. Devon's presence, once comforting, became suffocating. His certainty felt like judgment, even when unspoken. The silence between them grew heavier than any argument, filled with things neither dared to articulate. And in that silence, Abby's thoughts began to wander to places she knew were dangerous. Daniel entered that space not as an intruder, but as a quiet inevitability. He carried his own damage, his own unresolved grief, and that made him recognizable to her in a way Devon no longer was. There was something unsettling about how easily their interactions slipped into familiarity. How quickly they found common ground in their shared frustrations. What began as mutual understanding soon blurred into something more charged, something neither of them openly pursued yet neither resisted. For Daniel, the pull toward Abby was tangled in layers of unresolved pain. The loss he carried had not softened with time, it had calcified, leaving him emotionally raw and vulnerable. His attempt to rebuild himself through connection had already failed once, leaving behind a lingering sense of inadequacy and confusion. Being forced back into a platonic distance with someone he had begun to depend on emotionally left a void he did not know how to fill. Abby became that absence given form, someone who understood without requiring explanation, someone who mirrored his own disillusionment. But awareness did not translate into restraint. If anything, it intensified the conflict within him. He recognized the danger in their growing closeness, understood the inevitable consequences, yet found himself rationalizing each step forward. It was never framed as betrayal in his mind, not at first. It was comfort, temporary and necessary, something to dull the sharp edges of loss. But the line between comfort and desire eroded quickly, and once crossed, it became impossible to redraw. Abby, on the other hand, was not blind to the pattern repeating itself. The echoes of her past decisions lingered in the back of her mind, reminders of how easily vulnerability could turn into betrayal. She knew the path she was stepping onto, recognized every warning sign, every moment where she could have chosen differently. And yet, the deeper her conflict with Devon became, the easier it was to justify her actions. In her mind, she was not the one breaking something, she was reacting to something already broken. The shift became undeniable the night everything converged. A confrontation with Devon, sharper and more volatile than anything before it, left her emotionally unmoored. The argument was no longer about principles or disagreements, it was about identity. about whether either of them still recognized the person they had married. The aftermath left a hollow space where certainty used to be. And in that emptiness, restraint felt meaningless. Daniel was there, not by coincidence but by a series of small, deliberate choices neither of them fully acknowledged. The tension between them, long suppressed, surfaced with a clarity that made denial impossible. What followed was not impulsive, not accidental, it was the culmination of every unresolved feeling, every moment of proximity. Every suppressed thought finally given permission to exist. The weight of that decision did not arrive immediately. In the moment, it felt like release, like escape from the pressure that had been building for far too long. But relief has a short lifespan when it is built on something fragile. The reality of what had been done began to settle in, slowly at first, then all at once. For Abby, the aftermath was not just guilt, it was recognition. She saw the pattern in full, understood that this was not an isolated mistake but a reflection of something deeper within her. The need to seek solace elsewhere when confronted with emotional conflict. The inability to endure discomfort without searching for an escape, it all became impossible to ignore. And yet, even with that awareness, the damage had already been done. Daniel's reaction was quieter but no less destructive. The clarity he had avoided came crashing down, forcing him to confront the reality of his choices. What he had justified as emotional necessity now stood exposed as something far more complicated, far more consequential. The connection he had sought had only deepened his sense of dislocation, leaving him caught between what he wanted and what he knew he should have avoided. Meanwhile, Devon remained unaware of the full extent of the betrayal, but the shift in Abby was impossible to miss. Distance had turned into something colder, more definitive. The tension between them no longer simmered, it solidified into something unrecognizable. His frustration began to morph into suspicion, his certainty cracking under the weight of things he could not yet prove but could no longer ignore. And that is where everything became truly volatile. Because the truth, once set in motion, has a way of surfacing, often at the worst possible moment, often with the most devastating impact. Abby and Daniel had not just crossed a line, they had set into motion a chain of consequences that could not be undone. Every glance, every hesitation, every unspoken shift in behavior carried the potential to expose what they had tried to contain. What made it even more dangerous was not just the betrayal itself, but the fact that none of them were prepared for what would happen when it finally came to light. Devon's anger, once controlled and deliberate, threatened to become something far more destructive. Abby's guilt risked turning into defensiveness, into a refusal to accept responsibility in the face of confrontation. And Daniel, already struggling to reconcile his actions, stood on the brink of being pulled into a conflict that could consume all of them. There were no clean outcomes left, no path that did not lead to some form of loss. The choices had been made, the lines had been crossed, and the consequences were already beginning to take shape. What remained was the inevitable collision, one that would not just test their relationships, but fundamentally alter who they were when everything finally unraveled. The unraveling did not arrive as a slow revelation, it detonated without warning, in a moment where timing felt almost cruelly precise. What had been hidden in fragments suddenly aligned into a single, undeniable truth. Devon didn't need a confession, the evidence found him first. A message left unanswered, a glance that lingered too long, a silence that spoke louder than any denial, everything converged, stripping away illusion in an instant. Something inside him snapped, not loudly, but with a terrifying finality. The man who had once prided himself on control felt it slip through his grasp, replaced by a surge of raw, unfiltered fury. Yet beneath that anger was something far more dangerous, a sense of betrayal so absolute it hollowed him out. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the realization that while he had been fighting to hold on to something broken, Abby had already let it go. For Abby, the moment she understood that the truth had surfaced felt like stepping off a ledge with no ground beneath her. There was no space left for justification, no version of the story that could soften what had happened. Every choice she made, every step that led her here, now stood exposed. And the worst part was not Devon's anger, it was the look in his eyes, the absence of anything resembling love or recognition. She had not just hurt him, she had erased whatever remained between them. Daniel, caught in the collapse he had tried to avoid, felt the full weight of consequence crash down with suffocating force. What had once seemed like a shared escape now revealed itself as a trap of his own making. There was no role for him here that didn't end in destruction. The connection he had reached for had become the catalyst for something far darker, something irreversible. And then came the moment that shattered whatever fragile control remained. Devon didn't lash out blindly. Instead, his reaction was colder, more calculated, an edge of restraint that made it even more terrifying. The kind of anger that doesn't explode, but waits. The kind that promises consequences far beyond a single confrontation. As the silence stretched, thick and suffocating, one truth became unavoidable. This wasn't the end of their story, it was the beginning of something far worse. Because betrayal like this doesn't simply break people. It transforms them. And in that room, with nothing left to hide, all three of them understood the same thing at once. There was no going back, only forward into the damage they had created. And the reckoning that was now inevitable.